Hello, I'm Bob Denton, and welcome to another conversation. You know, religion has been part of the politics of our nation since the very beginning, but the role and impact of religion in the political life of our nation has evolved and certainly changed. For some, the decline of religion reflects the general decline in our culture, but for others, keeping religion out of politics would make for more just and rational politics. But joining me to explore the role and impact of religion in politics is Dr. Darla Schumm, Associate Provost and Professor of Religious Studies at Hollins University. And thanks so much for joining the conversation.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, you know, I have friends and they were saying, well, now what are some of the topics that you're going to do for your third season? And I would say, yeah, well, one show is religion and politics. And to a person, they would say, really? Seriously? Isn't that going to be dangerous? Well, you better be careful. I mean, it was just interesting how saying religion and politics, of course, I remember my mother, certainly in high school and what have you, was saying, now, son, never talk about sex, politics, and religion. And of course, ironically, I mean, I spent my adult life and career talking about two of the three. Just to make sure that's politics and religion now. I just want to make that straight. So, anyway, but is it fair to say, despite the kind of unease of using those two terms, is it fair to say that religion, or perhaps some would say Judean Christian values, actually played a role in the founding of our nation?
I think it is. I think while we can all agree that the founding fathers, as well as the colonists, the people, all valued the principle of religious freedom, they came at it from slightly different perspectives, and they had different expectations about what that meant. So for the founding fathers, they were very invested in not establishing a state religion. They didn't mandate that anyone had to follow a particular religion, but they also believed that morality and virtue were central to building a democratic and civic society, and they thought that morality and virtue, or that religion helped people be moral and virtuous people. And so they saw religion playing a role in helping to aid building the type of society that they envisioned. The colonists, in contrast, were also, of course, very invested in religious freedom. They were fleeing from primarily the British, England, but other parts of Europe where they were not allowed free expression of their religion. But most, if not all of them, were Christian, and they were invested in building a democratic society based on Christian morals and values. So not all the founding fathers agreed or necessarily believed that Christianity should be the central focus, but in both cases, religion played a role, I believe.
And if we look in, for example, the Constitution or Declaration of Independence, it seems like we can see some of the notions waved throughout that, and certainly some of the early, looking at legislators, elected officials, what have you, they freely, publicly made reference to God and acknowledging a greater force. And it seems to be explicit in some of those earlier exchanges in early government.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, even the deists like Jefferson and company didn't dismiss the notion of a creator, nor did they dismiss the notion of the importance of God or religion. Again, even if they weren't necessarily espousing Christian values. But we also have to remember that they were all coming out of a Christian context, right? So they weren't promoting a religiously pluralistic society in the sense that we understand that today. They weren't suggesting that Jews and Muslims and Christians or Native Americans should be all freely practicing their religion. And part of that was they couldn't imagine the pluralistic society that we have today, of course. So again, their Christian context kind of dictated how they understood religion, even if they personally didn't adhere to those principles.
You know, I had a professor early in my undergraduate career at Wake Forest, which was a Baptist college at the time.
Yeah.
And he said something that's always kind of stayed with me, and it was incredible. He said that he could virtually trace every law we have back to one of the 10 Commandments. And he had this big drawing with a stoplight and saying, okay, a stoplight means, and we have this social contract that you're supposed to stop. And of course, it used to be yellow was supposed to slow down, but now, who knows, that's debatable. And now, of course, we have the cameras. But he had this big diagram showing that what it goes back violating by us in terms of what we won't do as we should and have to make a law, tracing it back to one of the values of the 10 Commandments. And I just always kind of stuck with me. But that gets that strong notion of a foundation in terms of citizenship and how we should act.
Yes. Well, I'm not a lawyer. I haven't studied the law, and so I would have to do a little bit of research before I would agree or disagree with your professor. But I think regardless, if we could trace all of our laws back to the 10 Commandments or not, I think there's no argument that religion is one of the most powerful shapers of certainly American society and culture. And I often challenge my students to come up with a culture where religion isn't a powerful shaper. And it's hard. They have a very hard time doing it and often can't. So again, you know, depending on the context, it may or may not be Christianity, but certainly in the American context, I think there's no argument that Christian values and beliefs have been with us from the beginning. And even though we know that mainstream church attendance has declined significantly in the past several decades, the Public Religion Research Institute, their 2020 Census of Religion showed that almost 7 in 10 Americans still claim to be Christian. So again, whether they attend church on Sunday mornings or not, those are the values that still dominate our culture.
And let's talk a little bit about this notion of, because it seems like there's a blurry line when we talk about separation of church and state. And for some, it says, wait a minute, that separation guarantees you're not going to interfere with my worship. And of course, on the other side, wait a minute, your particular set of beliefs and values need not to be dominant in the government. How do you kind of see that tension? Because it seems to kind of be a blurred area that we still haven't contested today.
Well, if I could come up with the best way to approach that tension, I might be elected to political office. I don't know. I think it's not necessarily a negative or bad tension for us to grapple with. I think what gets us into trouble is when either our religious leaders or our political leaders attempt to impress one perspective as the right or true perspective. And that's when we get into quite a bit of trouble. Do I think that we should maintain this idea of separation of church and state? Yes, but I think it really depends on how we define that. I do not think the state should dictate how people worship, who they worship, nor do I think the state should elevate one particular tradition or set of beliefs above any others. I also think it's impossible for most people, most of us, to separate if we have a religious ideology, practice, belief, it's very hard to separate that from our worldview in other areas. So are we ever going to have a pure separation of church and state? Well, not as long as we have humans who are running the political arena. Their values, their morals, their religious ideologies are no doubt going to impact how they approach their work. But as long as we're not entering into a theocracy or, we must all believe this way, the tension, I think, is healthy and good for us to keep talking about.
Well, I personally think that religion can inform good character and honesty and moral behavior and things like that. And I never understood, and it seems like, for right or wrong, at a certain points in time, Catholics, Mormons, Jews had to somehow say, well, when I am elected and I have my foot on the steps of the Capitol, I can separate, and Kennedy did that a little bit, trying to ease some of the fears, but I never really understood how, as a person of my faith, it should inform everything that I think and do in behavior. And so for me, that was kind of a weird sign where it is such a point where you feel like you have to disassociate yourself from whatever religious values you may have. And that was an interesting kind of tension, not so much true today. You think that's right?
I do. I would say a couple of things in response to that. One is, as much as one might say they will leave their, as you say, leave their religion on the steps of the Capitol, again, like I was saying a moment ago, I think as humans, that's virtually impossible. We respond out of those values, those beliefs, our upbringing. So to say that we can be 100% objective and leave, especially if it's an important component of who we are, behind, I think is unrealistic. Again, how we carry that into the Capitol is where I think we can start to have a conversation about when it is and is not useful, when it does and doesn't become problematic or damaging. The other comment I would make, you said a moment ago you think religion, I forget how you put it exactly, but religion is part of morality or influences morality. And I think that's absolutely right. I think you can't have religion without morality. I do think you can have morality without religion. And I would go back to the Founding Fathers and say I think that's a bit of a flaw in their logic, that in order to have a democratic civil society, we must have religion because that helps to drive morality and virtue. I would argue you can have morality and virtue. The great Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant made that very argument, that virtue stands alone without religion. The reverse isn't true.
Very good point, very good point. An observation. Now, usually there's one point in the show where I get myself in trouble. And as you can tell, I'm about ready to do that now. Perhaps it's what's so interesting, and we actually, when you look at the decline of religion or you look at religion, it seems like we're 50-50, obviously, in our society, polarization. But there is differences as it relates to the role religion should play between Democrats and Republicans. The most recent 2024 Pew Center shows 38% Republicans say government should support religious values compared to 16% for Democrats. And of course, the Gallup 2022 poll, 67% of liberals believe in God compared to 95% of conservatives. I just found it interesting that even when it comes to a question of religion as it relates to perhaps politics, there's a party difference.
Some, but not all, but some of those statistics I think can be explained by what I have read recently is the fastest growing quote unquote religious group in the United States. Do you know what that is? The nuns or the religiously unaffiliated. So we could probably talk for another half hour about whether we should categorize them as a religious group. But nonetheless, in the polls, they are classified as a religious group. So in recent years, that group has grown significantly. Pew, as well as one of my favorite polling organizations, PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, shows that that group, so religiously unaffiliated and nuns, they use that term interchangeably, that group of people makes up between a quarter and some would argue a third, I think it's probably closer to a quarter of the American population. Those folks skew heavily toward Democratic. So again, I don't think that explains everything that your data is referencing, but I do think that increasingly these religiously unaffiliated are having an impact on what that data looks like.
Well, you know, when you think about running for president just as a broad thing, most of our presidents have been most often Protestant, Episcopalian, or Presbyterian. I think Biden is the second Catholic president, if I'm correct with that. Well, now,
Kennedy being the first, of course.
Do you think that someone could be a avowed atheist, agnostic, and get elected today? Or is that still so politically, I mean, is that even comprehensible?
It's hard to imagine that a self-proclaimed atheist or probably agnostic could get elected because there has been such an emphasis on both the faith commitment of our political leaders as well as the character, right? And we think about character again, it takes us right back to one of my favorite topics, morality and virtue. And that thread has been woven throughout American history, and it's an expectation of our religious leaders. I do think, however, we're in a very interesting time right now because of what happened in 2016 when Trump was elected. We saw a shift happening over the course of that election where voters, and by the statistics that you just cited a moment ago, the group of voters that tends to be more religious, they identify as religious. What did you say, 95% of Republicans identify as religious. That group of voters decided, apparently, that their candidate pushing their political agenda was more important to them than character or morality or virtue. And that is a shift. Will that translate eventually into the American public being able to elect an atheist or agnostic? I don't know. I think it's hard to imagine right now, but I also am learning anything is possible. I can't imagine what might happen next.
Well,
so I think we'll see.
Well, and that is fascinating in terms of the relationship between Trump and the evangelicals. Of course, some friends of mine, people say, Denton, you know, we're not electing the Pope, for goodness sakes. And so if I would like to have $1 every time someone has told that. But in this most recent Pew poll, 66% of evangelicals see Trump favorably. And that seems to be saying for churchgoers or not, and 51% specifically in terms of Catholics. The thing that I found fascinating in the data point, ironically, those who view Trump positively, they don't think he's religious.
No.
But will support people like them or people with beliefs like them. Somehow they say, no, he's not religious, but he will protect my religious thought. I just found that an interesting data point.
Yeah. Well, again, I think these are the people who are becoming increasingly focused on issues and policies and less focused on character of our political leaders. And so they have, I mean, the religious right formed not primarily as a religious movement, but as a political movement, or at the very least, equal parts, right? I mean, they had a political agenda that they wanted to push, and they invested in political leaders who supported their political agenda. So I think we're seeing maybe we might say the extreme of that playing out now with these Trump voters who have all but abandoned the need to elect a pope, I guess. I mean, they were never electing a pope, but the need to elect someone who identified religiously as they did.
So we have about 4 minutes or so remaining. So if we see not a causation, but at least a correlation between the decline of, and how do you define that? Religiosity, I'm more spiritual rather than religious. I mean, those kinds of definitional things. But isn't there a correlation in that with the increasing coarseness, rudeness, division in our society? That may be too strong to say, but in my mind, there's at least a correlation.
I'm not so sure I'm willing to concede that yet. Again, I'm gonna go right back to my favorite point, which is I do not necessarily think, I don't necessarily think that a decline in church attendance equates with a decline in a belief system. So I think that's one point. The other point is I absolutely do not think that a decline in church attendance sends us down a secular hole of debauchery and disagreement. So I would hope that we can rely on democratic principles that allow us to participate in civil discourse, and we can agree to disagree, whether we adhere to a particular religious belief system or not. We can agree to disagree with our religious neighbors who believe differently than we do, and that it doesn't have to be dependent on whether I go to the synagogue or the church or the mosque or the meditation hall, that we can still uphold some of these morals, values, and virtues that have been important to the building of this country.
And so we're down to a couple of minutes, and I want to provide you the last word. And so this maybe not tension, but this kind of unease between politics and religion. In the final minute and a half or so, what would your thoughts be for takeaway?
Well, I would hope that we can continue to have conversations, open and honest conversations like this, that as we live in an increasingly pluralistic society, that we view that as a gift and something that actually makes democracy stronger, that we are teaching our children how to have difficult conversations across difference, because the differences, it would appear, and I would hope, aren't going to go away. So we need to keep, instead of following your mother's instruction and your mother and many of our mothers' instructions to never talk about sex, politics, and religion. I'll plead the fifth on sex, but I will certainly argue long and hard that we need to keep talking about politics and religion, and we especially need to talk about it with people who think differently than us.
Well, believe it or not, that is all the time we have. What a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest. And as always, I want to thank you for joining us and hope you do so again for the next conversation with Bob Denton.